There's this odd passage in the book of Job, and if you don't know much about the book of Job, it's this book that's found toward the middle of your English Bible, and this book is about this guy named Job who has all of this wealth and prosperity, and he has so many daughters and sons, and he's got all this cattle and sheep and goats. He's a very wealthy person. And what Job is unaware of is that there's this spiritual battle going on behind the scenes in this story where the devil essentially approaches God and says, the only reason that Job worships you, the only reason that he's faithful to you is because you've given him all this stuff. But if you take all of his stuff away, he'll curse you just like everybody else. And God says, well, that's not true. That's not the reason that Job worships me. So he allows the devil to go and to torment Job and to take away all of his stuff, to the degree that Job's wife tells him he should curse God and die, and that Job's friends sit there with him. And at first, they're kind of helpful because they just sit there and don't say anything. But at some point, they open their mouths, and that's when the trouble starts. And they start to tell Job that, look, the reason that this is happening to you, obviously, is because God feels that you've done something wrong. You've done something immoral. Job, this wouldn't happen if you didn't deserve it. What they don't know is that that's not the case. That's not true. Job got caught up in a spiritual battle that he couldn't see. And while Job never curses God, while Job never turns away from God, he does have, as you can imagine, a lot of questions for God. And in fact, begins to make some accusations about how unfair all of this is. And there's this odd passage in the midst of all of this complaining from his friends and questioning from Job, where Job says this, and I've reflected a lot on this in this last year. He says, "Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." It's an odd passage, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. This last year has been challenging. And it's not the first year that's been challenging. In fact, there's been this phrase that's been tossing around in my mind for this last year as well. It's a phrase that probably a lot of you are familiar with. It's the phrase "can't even," as in I can't even handle one more thing. I can't even possibly log my child into online school one more time. I can't even deal with the fact that this line at the Five Guys, that the Wendy's, at the In-N-Out Burger is so incredibly long because all the other restaurants are closed. I can't even deal with the fact that my spouse is upset with me right now, or that my work has called me during my off hours in order to do one more thing. I can't even deal with that. The first time I became aware of the phrase "can't even" was around the time that my wife and I were expecting to have our first child, Jack. And so life had felt pretty doable up until then, and then we stupidly had a child, and then it made it way harder and way worse for a while. And it was tough that first year. But it started being tough even before he came into the world. I remember the first time we had to go register for baby gifts. And we thought, okay, we'll make a night of it. We'll go have dinner. Maybe we'll catch a movie. Then we'll go to Toys R Us. Remember when that was a thing? And we'll register for baby gifts there. And so we walked into the Toys R Us, and we went up to the desk, and we're like, we're here to register for gifts. We'd love for people to give us things for free. That's what we'd like. So whatever paperwork we need to start for that. And they said, oh, sure, we have a scanner, and you can do that. And they said, and we have a list of items that you might want to consider finding a type of all these different items. So great. I was thinking we would be scanning for 10 or 12 things. And they handed me a front and back sheet of paper in tiny, tiny print of all the things we might need for this child. And I just didn't know you needed this many things to have a baby and keep a baby alive. It just seemed like a whole lot of stuff. And I looked at the very kind person at the desk there, and I said, is this everything? And they said, no, here's the second page. And they pulled that out. And it wasn't everything. So we took that, we started walking the store. And all these things are they protect the baby's life. They make sure the baby gets from point A to point B while still being alive. All this. And I told them, I was how do we pick this stuff out? I need to take this list home. I need to look up reviews. I need to see what the safety ratings are. I thought we could just walk through. We can't do this at all. I was she said, could we just pick out one thing tonight? Let's just pick out one thing. She's like, what if we just picked out a baby bath? Just the bath to bathe, the baby in. I was like, well, okay, that seems easy enough. I said, let me pull up Consumer Reports real fast and see what baby bath they recommend. And the first or second sentence in that online article said, one of the biggest reasons that babies die is they drown in the bathtub. I'm like, well, this is a bigger decision than I thought it was going to be. So I just remember us sitting in the rocking chairs, just rocking back and forth, like, it's not okay. We're not going to be okay. We can't even do this. Like, what are we going to do? So we picked out washcloths. They were Elmo. Solid decision, I felt like, at the time. So and I just felt like, okay, there's going to be a whole list of stuff that gets thrown at us, and I'm already feeling like I can't even deal with all the stuff that's going to be thrown. And then there was this really popular cartoon that made a huge comeback this year. It is a dog sitting in a room that's on fire, and the dog just says, this is fine, right? Like, this became like the mantra for 2020, because a lot of us were feeling exhausted, burnt out, or like we can't even leading into 2020, and then a pandemic happened. And so this last year has been difficult, and this ended up being kind of a mantra. And 2021 isn't off to a great start either. There was this ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. About $54 billion, it's estimated, or more worth of worldwide product was lost because of this ship blocking other ships from getting through. One of my favorite photos was this little guy trying to get it free. That did not work. How many of you this year, though, have felt like this? Pushing this. And it just doesn't feel like it works. We were, my wife and I had only moved here about 6 months before the pandemic happened. We were brand new to California. We were brand new to Inland Hills. And we had ideas of what the first year was going to look like. And spoiler alert, wasn't supposed to look like this. And so I found myself in March and in April and May of last year, and maybe you did too, just occasionally feeling overwhelmed by like a wave of emotion. And I would just, I would get my son Jack on his Zoom call for the day for his class, and I would try to get his work done. And then I would sometimes go in the other room and start to respond to emails or Slack messages from our team here or whatever. And sometimes I would just feel this like wave of emotion wash over me. And I was like, what is that? I don't know what that is. And it took me a while to figure it out, but after reading a little bit, I determined like what it was grief. I was grieving the loss of connection, of seeing people. I was grieving the loss of what I thought this was going to look like, us moving here and being part of this church. Like, in my mind, there was a certain shape to that, and that shape got obliterated last March. And so I was grieving that. I was grieving the loss of certain things that we like to do and the loss of scheduling and consistency that we'd found. I was grieving a lot of stuff. And as I talked to a number of you during that time on Facebook and Instagram and Instant Messenger and text messages, you were grieving as well. A lot of us felt a lot of grief toward the beginning of all of this. But there was a few weeks there, once the pandemic started, that it felt like maybe this was going to be okay. There was this feeling that, we're all in this together. You remember some of the commercials, like companies had no idea what to do with the advertising space they'd bought at that point. So they were just showing commercials of people, sitting there with their thinking heads on and looking into the distance and saying things like, we're all in this together. Goodyear Tire is here for you. Like, I don't even know what that means, Goodyear Tire. Like, I can't even go anywhere right now. But people were doing the best that they could. And then within a few weeks, it feels like we flipped from we're all in this together to like, actually, every man for himself. That's the route we're going to take here. That's what we're doing. We went from kumbaya, peace circles on the beach, to basically the purge. I mean, in an instant. It happened very quickly. And so then there was these questions. Like, I remember this YouTube video that came out early on, and it was so hopeful. And it was this son telling his child several years from now what the pandemic was like, right? And he was like, at the beginning of 2020, we had lost the importance of how close we all were. We had gotten too busy, overly scheduled. And then this pandemic hit, and we all realized that what we have is each other. And we pulled together, and we unified. And we decided we would never be that busy again. And then 2021 and 2022, we were changed for the better. That was super naive, huh? That we thought that's how it was going to go. It's not how it went. And after grieving for a few months, my grief turned to something else. I wasn't grieving anymore. I wasn't getting hit with those like waves of emotion. But I just noticed that I just didn't have something that I did have before. Like, for instance, I'm an idea person. I love to come up with ideas. I love to solve problems. When I just noticed by like May, June, July of last year, I was feeling tapped out of ideas. I was feeling like not that helpful or useful to some of our team here or to my family. I was trying. I was getting up. I was doing the work. I wasn't laying in bed all day. I just felt like whatever that extra thing was that was normally there for me, I would go to reach for it, and it just wasn't there. anymore. And maybe you felt some of that as well. I felt like, there was a lot of I can't even take one more thing, Like, as we're trying to figure out here at Inland Hills Church, okay, what other regulations is the city, the state, the county going to release, the CDC, the WHO? Like, what all are we going to have to manage and change and shift? And we're still doing that every single week. We're still having to work that out and figure that out. And it's still complicated. And it still feels like some weeks that I can't even deal with one more shift right now. We're just settled into a rhythm. How do we move from here to there? And then my wife, Emily, started doing a new thing as well that wasn't helpful, just like my stuff wasn't helpful. My wife normally sleeps, like she has been almost our entire marriage. We're married almost 18 years now. She has been very regimented about her sleep. And she needs roughly 18 to 20 hours a night. Is that right, babe? Something like that? Okay, so something like that. She consistently made sure she got at least 7 to 8, sometimes 9. Like she really, sleep was a priority for her. And then over the last few months, right, we're past the grief stage, but we're in something else that's thrown us off and doesn't feel quite right. She has started, once the kids are in bed and we talk or finish dinner or whatever we do, then she starts watching movies on Netflix. And not like Academy Award-winning, high-quality caliber films. We're talking the worst crap you can imagine. Just terribly made, terribly plotted, terribly acted, that kind of stuff. In fact, when I found out, she would watch this stuff, sometimes for several hours at night, and she would stay up till 12 or 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, really late, and then wake up exhausted the next morning when it was time to go to work. And we looked online, there's actually a name for this, because lots of people are doing something like this right now. It's called revenge bedtime procrastination. It's where all the fun that you wish you'd had during the day, but you had to delay, you try to throw it in at night. You try to take your mind off something. And it's becoming more and more popular right now because, for many of us, our days are so filled with constantly having to shift and bend and turn and pivot and figure out how to do the next thing. The only time we have is maybe after the kids are in bed at night or after the work has died down at night or after we've had a meal, and we're doing more and more of this. And so Emily was watching, Hallmark Christmas movies and stuff, like Christmas in Homestead or Finding Santa or A Wish for Christmas, or The Christmas Cottage, or Sharing Christmas, or Angel of Christmas. I'm just saying, there's a lot of Hallmark Christmas movies, and they look a lot alike. And for many of us, the phrase we kept using or hearing from others is, I just feel so tired. Are you sleeping enough? Yeah, I am, but I just feel so tired. Are you taking mental breaks? Yes. Stop it. Shut up. I just feel so tired. For many of us, we just felt this constantly. An article was written a couple of weeks ago, and it turns out it's had massive resonance with our culture because sometimes what you need to do is name the feeling you're having and identify it so that you can deal with it. It's the same reason that recognizing that back in March and April and May of last year, what I was feeling was grief. It was helpful to just recognize, oh, that's what that is. There's a psychological term called languishing. It's a sense of stagnation and emptiness. Adam Grant wrote about it a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times. He's a psychologist, and he says this: languishing is the neglected middle child of mental health. It's the void between depression and flourishing, the absence of well-being. You don't have symptoms of mental illness, but you're not the picture of mental health either. You're not functioning at full capacity. Languishing dulls your motivation. It disrupts your ability to focus. It triples the odds that you'll cut back on work. For many of us, that feeling we have, that we reach for that extra we normally grasp onto and it's not there. That idea that we're normally able to generate, we can't do it. That get up and go, we're out of bed and we're ready to face the day. We're still getting up, we're still going, but it is a struggle increasingly every single day. Or that feeling that if I do one more adulting thing today, right? I've already been to work, I've done the thing with the kids, I've filed taxes. If I have to do one more adulting thing today, I can't even bring myself to do that. It's a thing that maybe you would normally do, but right now, you're languishing. And so adding it to an already completely full plate feels like it's going to be the last thing to just tip you over the edge. And so for many of us, I think that we are in this area right now. We just feel so tired. And after the year we've had, of course we do. Of course we do. And so this week, and for the next couple of weeks, I just want us to I just want us to think about 3 different areas. This week, I feel so tired. Next week, I feel so anxious. And the final week, I feel so angry. And I just want every week for us to think through these feelings that we're having and to see the wisdom of Jesus. Jesus, by the way, comes out of this long Hebrew tradition of wisdom literature, and he invites us into this new way of life. If it's not clear to you by now, if you've been hanging around for a while, like I absolutely think that the best, most important decision you could make would be to put your trust in Jesus, to call him the Lord of your life, which means simply that he just gets to tell you what to do and how to live. There's an eternal life component to that, but it starts now. Like it's not just some distant future in some other place. There's a life that begins now with Christ and echoes into eternity. And that's what I want to invite you into, seeing bits and pieces of over the next several weeks. So for those of you who are already followers of Jesus Christ, this should be easy for you. You've already convinced yourself that Jesus is worth following. But for those of you who aren't, maybe for those of you who are struggling with faith or the idea of religion or Jesus in general, first of all, I'm really glad that you're either here today or watching online. I'm so thankful that we've got a few minutes of your time. My hope is that you'll see some of what Jesus invites us into and that you'll find it compelling. Because if you're going to start a journey with Jesus, compelling is a great place to start. A few years ago, I heard a quote from a theologian and philosopher named Dallas Willard. And what he said wasn't surprising. I agreed with it immediately, but I just never thought of it quite that way before. And for some reason, it did something for me. It changed something in me. And this is what he said about Jesus. He says, saying Jesus is Lord can mean little in practice for anyone who has to hesitate in saying Jesus is smart. He's not just nice, he is brilliant. He is the smartest man who has ever lived. I agreed with it as soon as I heard it, but I also recognized that when I thought of Jesus, I didn't typically conceptualize Jesus as the smartest person who has ever lived. That's just not how I thought about him. But as I realized that decade after decade and century after century, as we learn more about neurology, brain science, psychology, sociology, Jesus continues to point us to a way of life that all the science continues to confirm that that's the best way to live. And from 2,000 years ago, his teachings and the way that he invites us into continues to carry heavy resonance now, which means I think there's a really good chance he's the smartest man who's ever lived. Willard goes on and says, he is now supervising the entire course of human history while simultaneously preparing the rest of the universe for our future role in it. He always has the best information on everything, and certainly on the things that matter most in the human life. So if we want to understand how to live a more satisfying life, I think it's a helpful place to start with Jesus. Jesus lives a life of purpose and celebration and community and gratitude. In fact, Jesus, from the very beginning, is like laser focused on his mission to change and transform the world. He celebrates, like the very first miracle he does in John chapter 2 is he's at a wedding party that's been going on for 3 days. They partied so much better than us 2,000 years ago. So it's in the 3rd day of the wedding party, and the host is embarrassed because they've run out of wine. You might also, if you'd been funding it for 3 days. That's a lot of wine. They run out of wine. And Jesus' mom comes to him and she was like, hey, they're out of wine. Could you do something about that? Seeming to imply that she figures he can do something about that. And they have an interesting conversation. Ultimately, he decides to make more wine for the wedding, not just a little bit. He fills up 6 jars of probably 25-ish gallons apiece. It makes about 150 gallons of wine. And when the wine is tasted, the people who taste it go to the people who are hosting, and they're like, usually people save the best wine for the beginning and give us the terrible wine later on once we're, too hammered to know the difference. You've saved the best stuff for last. Jesus didn't just make wine, he made awesome wine. And Jesus joined in the celebration. That's the very first miracle he does. He lives a life of purpose. He lives a life of celebration. The celebration, by the way, he changes this water into wine in these giant jars. These jars were normally used for purification rituals within the Jewish context. It's like Jesus is saying, this purification context that you're used to, God's doing a new thing. And it starts here, and it starts now. He celebrates, but in the midst of the celebration still has purpose. He lives in community. He gathers these people to follow after him so that they can understand, so that he can teach and show them what it's like to live in the way he's inviting all of us to, a Godward life. And gratitude. He lives a life of gratitude. Multiple places, as we'll see in just a few moments, he shows others what it looks like to be thankful regardless of what else is going on. What's interesting is that as I did more reading on this last couple of weeks on what the cure for languishing is, I kept reading things like you need to have purpose, and you need to make sure you celebrate, and you need to try to get in community, and you need to live a life of thankfulness and gratitude. It's almost like Jesus knew exactly how to live even before the New York Times published an article about languishing. So today, we could talk about any of these. But what I want to do each and every week is to give you something really practical for you to leave here with and for you to practice throughout the week. So today, we're going to talk specifically about gratitude. And we're going to be in the book of John in chapter 11. So if you want to turn there with me in your Bibles or your digital copies of your Bible, you can do that. We'll be there in just a moment. We want to talk about gratitude. This story that we're looking at is an unusual one. If Jesus started off his ministry with this miracle of turning water into wine, the miracles keep getting bigger and bigger the longer that he goes. And the miracle we're about to look at is the final one that he performed before being arrested, tried, crucified. In this miracle, he's raising Lazarus from the dead. So he starts off turning water into wine, which is impressive, a great party trick, great celebration, great purpose. But by the end of this thing, he's raising dead people back to life. And dead people just don't come back to life. But as he arrives at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, who has been dead for days at this point, he gives this prayer, and it's a really interesting place to say what he says. In fact, it's really easy to miss it if you haven't looked for it in the past. So they took away the stone from the tomb that held Lazarus, and then Jesus looked up and he said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." Before anything even happens, before Lazarus walks out, Jesus begins his prayer with thanksgiving. And he's really intentional about it. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." So several things going on here that Jesus is he is thanking God the Father out loud. And he's doing it out loud because he wants people to know that the Father has sent the Son. But he also wants people to understand that there is an act of gratitude that is a way of living that goes all the way down. That even before God does anything, we're thankful that he hears us. We're thankful that he partners with us. It's this life of thanksgiving and gratitude, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. And keep in mind, Jesus is praying this in the midst of some of the most difficult circumstances. His friend has died. He is surrounded by mourners at this point. And in the midst of all this, thank you that you have heard me. Thank you that you've heard. Not thank you that you have raised. Not thank you that you've already done. Thank you that you have heard me. And he goes on. When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." This would have been a scene. I mean, you're surrounded by mourners. And so there has to be some combination of emotion that happens here as Lazarus walks out of this tomb. Those who knew him best and those who maybe trusted Jesus most would probably immediately be excited. But in addition to the excitement and the hope and the enthusiasm that were probably there, I mean, when a dead man walks out of the tomb, that's a little freaky, man. Like, I got to think that some of them were just a bit terrified. And if I'd have been Lazarus, I'd have, played it up, definitely. But I got a feeling he was so discombobulated, he probably just walked out. And they've got to take these linens off. And in the midst of all this, thanksgiving, gratitude. Father, thank you that you have heard me. It's not the only time that Jesus approaches the Father in gratitude. In fact, he does it repeatedly. Before Jesus feeds the 5,000, he thanks the Father. Before Jesus feeds the 4,000, he thanks the Father. Before Jesus breaks bread and drinks of the cup during his last meal, his last supper with the disciples, he thanks the Father. Even his prayer that he prays as a model prayer, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, glorious be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." There's this idea baked in, while he doesn't use the word thanksgiving, that you are good and you are glorious. And there is a base level of gratitude to go with those things. Like we want what you want here because of your goodness. We are so grateful for who you are that we want the earth to reflect it. Jesus always points people to thanksgiving and to gratitude. In 1 Thessalonians, one of the very first Christians, Paul, He writes this, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. In other words, in everything that you see, rejoice. Why should we rejoice? Well, James tells us this, the brother of Jesus. He writes, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Now, a couple things I want to say about this. First of all, Jesus' ministry teaches us a lot about what God is against. See, Jesus came and taught, and a lot of times we throw out Jesus' teaching and Jesus' miracles, and we just focus on his death on the cross and his resurrection. And don't get me wrong, those are two incredibly important events. You cannot understand the work of Jesus or really the scriptures without understanding his death and his resurrection. Those two are absolutely pillars to getting this. But Jesus had a lot of ministry that the scriptures teach us. His teaching and his miracles, he's constantly pushing back against all the evil and darkness in the world. So he's healing the sick. He's helping the blind to see. He's casting out demons. And in doing all of these things, in the way that he teaches, what he's saying is that this is not the way the world is supposed to be. This damage, this pain, this harm, you will go through this, but it's not the way it's supposed to be. And God opposes it. God opposes the pain. God opposes the damage. God opposes the harm. And so his ministry shows that all the goodness in the world is from God, and all the darkness in the world Jesus is pushing back on. But because we do live in a fallen and dark world, we will experience pain in this lifetime. It is absolute positive that will happen. In fact, every relationship you have, every one of them, will end in tragedy. Either the relationship will fracture, or that person will pass away, or you will pass away. Every relationship you have, as good as it may be, as life-giving and wonderful and loving as it may be, all of them are destined to end in tragedy, which means every one of us will walk through dark, difficult, painful moments because we live in a fallen world where death is the natural result of that fallenness. It's one of the things that Jesus came to fix, to take away, to make it to where we don't have to bear it anymore. So what I wouldn't want us to do is, in thinking about gratitude or thankfulness, like it's really hard to be thankful if you're always looking at someone who you perceive has more. It doesn't mean that God loves them more, and it doesn't mean that they have more merit. It just means like the way the world, this fallen world worked out for them, perhaps they ended up with more. They could have even gotten it by ill-begotten means, but they may have more. It doesn't matter if someone has more. What James says is that every good and perfect gift, every one, and surely you have something in your life that you can say is a good or perfect gift. Every one of those comes from above. Don't confuse the gifts that you have, though, with saying that, oh, I deserved it, or God gave it to me because I have merit and other people don't. In fact, it's always helpful. I have found this helpful to remind myself of this. Better men than me have lived harder lives than mine. Better men than me have lived harder lives than mine. Of the 12 disciples that followed after Jesus, one of them took his own life, Judas. One died in prison on the island of Patmos, in prison for his faith. And the other 10 were all martyred for their faith. There are challenges to following Christ, and there are challenges in life just generally that we all have to face. But I've met with pastors from all over the world who are great men and women of the gospel, and yet they work for a church where they're having to work 2-3 jobs to make ends meet, or their family has gone through some difficult thing. Or I know pastors in China who are having to pull their whole church underground if they want to really preach the gospel in a way that they feel like is consistent with the scriptures. Those people, many of them, have lived better lives than I have, are farther along than I am, and yet they don't have as many blessings as I do. So what I want to do is thank God for every blessing in my life. And the people who have more, I don't have to think about that too hard. I don't have to get bitter about that. And people who have less, I want to continue to pray for them and hope the best for them. And we all look forward to an eternal time where we are all together with the Spirit of God. That's the hope. Because better men than me have lived harder lives than mine. And so I am thankful, I am grateful, but it doesn't mean that every blessing I have is because I specifically deserved it. This tradition of being thankful, of being grateful. It doesn't start with Jesus, and it certainly doesn't end with Jesus. So I want to go back to one of the earliest times in all of Scripture for just a moment to see this concept of believing in a Lord who provides. In Genesis 22, there's this story that's very famous. Abraham, who's called by God, is told to go sacrifice his son Isaac. It's a horrific story. It's horrific to approach it with a 21st century mindset and to read God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. You see, for Abraham, at the time that this happens, it wouldn't have been surprising at all. In the culture that he grew up in, you always ended up having to sacrifice more and more if you wanted to keep the gods happy. So when the one true God, his God Yahweh, tells him to sacrifice his son, that wouldn't have been surprising. It would have been painful, but it wouldn't have been surprising. But as we read this story with 21st century eyes, we have to be asking ourselves, if you have a heart, you're asking yourself, what kind of God has a father sacrifice their own son? And the resounding answer from this passage is, not this God, not Yahweh. In fact, I think he does this to dramatically teach Abraham that that's not the kind of God he is. So as Abraham's just about to sacrifice his son, God stops him. And then Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket, he saw a man caught by its horns, a ram caught by its horns, not a man. That would be a very different story. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. By the way, many centuries from then, another sacrificial substitute would happen. Many centuries from then, God would send his only son, his one and only, that his son may step into the death that all of us were hurtling toward because of our own sin and darkness and brokenness, the death that we deserved, but that God longed for us to avoid. And so many centuries after God sent a ram to be a sacrifice so that Isaac could be spared, God sent his son to be a sacrifice so that we could be spared. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day, it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. The Lord will provide. The Hebrew for that is Yahweh Hirah. Yahweh Hirah. We're not actually sure how to pronounce YHWH, Yahweh. It sounds a lot like breathing in the original Hebrew, Yahweh, Yahweh. You can't even close your mouth around these particular letters. Like they're more like breath in and out. You can't even get your mouth around, in other words, the sound of the name of God, Yahweh, Yireh. You may have heard it transliterated to Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. It's this belief that Jesus has even while Lazarus is in the tomb. This belief that Paul has even as he sees his brothers and sisters in Christ being persecuted by the Roman Empire and being persecuted by those who do not agree with their faith. It's the belief that James, the brother of Jesus, has, even as he continually gets flogged, persecuted, and imprisoned for preaching the name of the one who came to save us all. This belief that even in the darkest of moments, even in the most languishing of times, the Lord will provide. He is good, and I am thankful for him. And it is this belief that we find in the middle of the book of Job, in the most unlikely of places. Job has been foggy of mind. In his pain and his suffering and his loss, he's been basically seeing God almost as a Satan, as a threat in and of himself, and doesn't understand why he's lost so much. But in the midst of this fog, he has this lucid moment, this moment of clarity. And he knows that after this moment's over, he's going to probably head right back into the fog. And so he wishes he could capture this moment. And so he says, oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end, he will stand on the earth. It's like Job is saying, look, I've been foggy and all this loss and all this pain and this suffering. Like I've not always thought of God well in the midst of all of this. And I'm having this moment, though, of clarity. And I know I'm going to head back into the fogginess in just a moment, but I don't ever want to forget this moment. I wish I could write this on a rock, that I know that my Redeemer lives. And then in the end, he will stand up on the earth. I wish I could write it down on a rock, inscribe it permanently. Because even in a few minutes, when I get foggy again, I just wish I had the rock. I could still hold the rock up and say, I still understand this. With everything else going wrong, I still have this. I want to write it down. I want to inscribe it forever. I know that my Redeemer lives. And then in the end, he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh, I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. It's just this idea that even in the midst of everything, in the midst of it all, while I'm feeling my suffering, if I could just write it down, the goodness of God, remember it, remember my own gratefulness and gratitude, and perhaps even as I continue to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I would fear no evil. You see, we must constantly remind ourselves of that which is most important. And when we're languishing, it can be easy to forget that I know that my Redeemer lives, and I am grateful for that, and I feel gratitude for what I have. You were handed a slip of paper when you came in. And I'd love for you to pull that out right now. And if you're joining us on eChurch, I'm about to give you a way to participate in just a moment as well. If you're listening to our podcast, I've got a way for you to participate as well. Here's what we're going to do, though, in just a few minutes. In just a couple minutes, I want you to write on that piece of paper. And if you don't have something to write with right now, you could do it in the lobby afterwards. I want you to write down the name of someone or something or some place or some experience that you are grateful for. See, it's in the practice of gratitude that we stop turning so much in on ourselves and start to reflect outward. It's in the practice of gratitude that we can be set free from our prison of self-preoccupation. It's in the practice of thankfulness and of gratitude that we can not focus so much on the fear that we have or the anxiety that we're feeling or the languishing that we're experiencing, because we can point to something tangibly and say, you know what, this thing here, God, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And so in just a moment, if you have a piece of paper and you're here on campus, I want you to write down the name of someone or something or some place or some experience that you've had that you are grateful for. And if you're joining us on eChurch, there's going to be a URL place in our eChurch on our Inland Hills eChurchExperience.com where you can click on that link and you can send us a message as well. And if you're and tell us someone or something or some place or some experience that you're thankful for. And if you're in the car listening to this and it's not a great time to pull your phone, please don't pull your phone out if you're driving right now and start trying to do this. You can just send us an email at ihc@inlandhillschurch.com. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take whatever you send in or whatever you write down on a piece of paper, and right out here in our lobby, we just started a wall of gratitude, just a wall of thanksgiving, to remind ourselves that we want to be a community that is grateful even in the midst of our languishing, grateful in the midst of our difficulty, because it's the kind of life Jesus invited us into, the kind of way that the very first followers of Christ decided that they would live. And we have the opportunity to do it now. So in just a few moments, we're going to give you, we're going to sing a song. The band's going to come up and they're going to worship. And it's a new song, so you may not be familiar with it. You can just listen to it if you want to. I'm going to have you stay seated for it. And as you're hearing the songs, the words of Jehovah Jireh sung across you, that the Lord will provide, sung over you, as you think of someone or something or some place or some experience that you're thankful for, you can just write it out. Could be a word, could be a whole mini story. It's whatever you want. Or be thinking, if you don't have the time to write it down right now, be thinking of what that might be. And then I'm going to come back up and we're going to pray together. And I've got one more little gift that we're going to give you as you're on your way out. So stay seated. Let the team sing over you. And if you want to join in singing in your worship, we invite you to do that as well.